studies,
on next
they're
year.
tens of thousands of dollars depending on the
Okay.
schedule. Got it, thank you.
Okay, I want to call the Hopkinton Town Council workshop of September 11th to order with a moment of silent meditation on the anniversary of 9/11, 16 years ago, and a salute to the flag. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Open a workshop for the following: discussion with Chris Kearns, Chief of Program Development at the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources, DOA, regarding recent changes in renewable energy in Rhode Island and 2 new state laws being enacted relevant to solar. Chris.
Thank you for having me. Should I, how do you guys want to do it with the laptop and stuff? Do you want me to click on it?
Yeah. Yeah,
Perfect. I'll just sit here then.
that'd be great.
Perfect. All right, so basically, I think the council president asked me to maybe...
Wait, the camera's on, right?
Yes.
Yep. How about we disconnect the microphone and he walk it over? We want to make sure people.
Oh, okay, gotcha. I can speak out loud if you want me to. If that
We
helps.
got a mic, we'll get real
Gotcha.
close.
So now I'm checking.
Thank you very much. Or I'll slide over a little bit. So the council president asked me to, I think, start from the back and work my way up in terms of some of the existing state laws that just went into effect or that have in effect before I dive into the renewable programs.
Yeah, the permitting one, I guess, that
Sure.
seems to be an easier one for us
Yeah,
to deal with, and then we'll get into the fun course.
You got it. So why don't I start with this one first? So this past legislative session, we worked on a bill to kind of streamline the building electric permit process, just to have some consistency statewide. So OER is currently working on a building electric permit for all scale solar projects, whether it's residential or commercial or a ground mount system. And basically, we are working with various stakeholders. I think we've been invited nearly all the building, local electrical officials within all the municipalities that we have email access to be part of these stakeholders, but also the State Building Commission Office and the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns to weigh in. We're currently on the second draft of that building and electric permit application. The goal is to have it wrapped up late October, early November, and then we go into the rule regulation process with it wrapping up, so it goes into effect statewide. So all municipal building electric officials and renewable developers will use that new statewide building permit type application. The building fees, electric fees, those are still being predetermined at the local level, so you guys will determine what the appropriate charge is, but we'll just have consistency in terms of just a statewide type application now going forward in the new year.
It'll be helpful to have that, you know, in terms of one process or one place where they go to get the permits. So you know how many are out there, I imagine.
Exactly. It's basically a residential solar roof mount installation is no different whether it's in Westerly or Woonsocket. It's the same, has to meet all the applicable building code standards, so why not just have one statewide permit so the building officials know exactly what the market is and the developers know what they're getting into. So that's been pretty straightforward. It's been non-controversial. Again, we have the second draft of the application out for stakeholders, municipalities to weigh in on. We've got another stakeholder meeting next week to get any additional feedback, and then pending the result of that meeting, we'll probably proceed with the rule regulation process and have it wrapped up hopefully by early November at the latest.
Everybody's gonna collect different fees.
Yep.
We have different fees. Now, where do the fees go?
So also that's a revenue, it's no different than the existing building electric.
How do we pay back the state?
You don't pay back the state.
That's what I needed to know. How is the state affording this?
So ultimately, it's just the existing OER and State Building Commission Office staff time that we're committed to doing this process. So the reality is it's not a lot of work because it's basically pulling together the existing building electric permit process that are used right now for solar projects and streamlining it into maybe like I think it's about a 2 or 3 page application now, where it's basically you check all the boxes, you submit all the critical information that that building or electric official will need at the local level. It's really not a lot of work on our part, just because we're just basically pulling from existing processes. And you guys already collect building electric fees for solar projects, so ultimately you would continue to collect the fees, you're just using the statewide application form instead of the 39 different that we had prior.
Who does the inspections themselves? Who actually goes to the site to make sure they're doing the work they said they do?
So in terms of the installations of the systems, I believe those are randomly inspected by the state's electrical officials. So you have licensed electricians that would randomly go out sometimes to job sites to check the installations. I know that's done on the electrical side. I'm less familiar personally with what the building officials do once they issue building permits, whether it's a solar project or a new extension on a property or a new commercial building within the town in terms of what inspections they take. I might have to circle back with you on that. I just don't have the answer right now.
So I just wonder what's going to be expected. I guess the bottom line is what will be expected at this time from the town. What part does the town play? They file for an application, you folks look it over, they decide that what they're proposing makes sense electrically or whatever, and then it gets kicked back to the town as a...
No, so basically what we're doing is we're developing the application form, and then once it goes into effect on January 1st, we don't have any role. So you're just using the statewide application form.
Oh,
But you guys are the ones basically saying, okay, meets all the criteria, where's your check for processing payment and stuff like that. So fundamentally, the only thing we're doing is just having a consistency across
One
the
place to go for
state.
the application.
Exactly. So
Oh, okay.
it's still submitted at the local building official,
Gotcha.
the local electrical official office. We're just developing what that application has to look like statewide for the new year.
Do you think it'll be on the OER, like a website?
It will be on the OER website. We're also working, a lot of municipalities are transitioning to e-permitting, everything being done online. I think we're at about 15 or 16 municipalities that have now everything done, both if they still want to do it locally, but a lot of people are shifting to just do e-permitting instead of having to drive to that specific town. I'm not sure where Hopkinton stands regarding that
I
process.
saw something
but-
not too long ago that we started, I think.
Yeah.
We're in it.
Yeah, so the objective is basically that this would be a new application statewide that ultimately everybody would be doing the e-permitting process.
So we still got a little bit to go on this particular one.
Yeah, a little bit to go. I would say probably another 4 or 5 weeks, and then we'll distribute the final version of the application form. Basically, what we've been doing is, this is ultimately a rule regulation process, but what we don't like to do is draft it internally and then put it out to public comment. We'd rather just put it out there and work on it. So when we have to get to that 30-day public comment period, there is no public comment because everybody got, to a certain degree, what they wanted in the application.
Okay, that's the easy part.
That's the easy one. I think this is also a pretty easy one because I think you guys have already addressed it. So the other one, this was from the 2016 legislative session. This was relating to establishing a statewide commercial tangible tax formula. What we were seeing prior to that was, again, you know, all these projects popping up across the state. Tax assessors are wondering, well, what do I assess the tangible tax value on these systems? So this law was passed during the 2016 session. We worked with the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns, the Renewable Energy Community, the Rhode Island Tax Assessors Organization in the summer of 2016 to implement this new law, where we basically went out and asked the tax assessors, well, prior to this law, what was the dollar value that you were assessing for these projects? So we got I think a half dozen, 12 or a dozen projects across the state, and we looked at what that average dollar value was. It was $4.76 per kW that they were charging. And the law used a baseline of $5. So being that the average was less than what the baseline was, we just kept it simple and kept it to $5. So this went into effect on January 1st, 2017. If I recall correctly, actually I saw one of these posted in your guys.
Yeah, we just did it
You guys
last week.
last week.
Yeah.
So basically, this would be all for the projects that are popping up in the town where they're building the solar system and they're just selling the revenue back to National Grid through a 20-year tariff. There's a formula now in place where it's $5. So I believe there's a couple like 251 megawatts, so you do $5 per kW times the 1,000 kW would spit out what that dollar amount would be, and that would be your revenue source for each year for the duration of the tariff that they're receiving revenue from National Grid on.
The one we approved on 91 was 13.8.
Okay, yep.
So about
the-
69,000.
Okay. Yeah, so municipalities will do this it's required for a municipality that has a solar ordinance and entering the tax treaty agreements. So this has been in place for nearly a year now. Several municipalities have adopted the codified taxation ordinance, the local level like you guys did last week. So this has also been pretty straightforward. Again, it just develops some consistency across the state, because one thing that we're mindful of is all these programs that are available, ultimately they're all paid for Rhode Island ratepayers through your electricity bill. So for us to have a consistent, fair dollar value to compensate the towns, we can incorporate that into the program design and thus minimize how much these programs cost to ratepayers. All right, so let's see, maybe let's go. So I'm going to plan on going through these slides quickly. I'm not a big PowerPoint fan, but feel free to stop me along the way if you have any questions. So again, what we wanted to do is just give you guys an overview of the renewable energy programs that are available to Hopkinton constituents that want to pursue projects. So we already addressed items 3 and 4, so we'll just focus on the state's policies. Ultimately, all of the programs that we have available, these are the primary technologies that we're seeing proposed associated with them. I would say 90% of it is solar related. The remaining 5 to 10% is the other 3 technologies, probably with about 7 to 8% of that coming from wind projects in certain parts of the state.
What's that third one?
The third one is anaerobic digestion, so that's like converting biomass. So that's like wood pulpit, cut down trees that are going to the landfill. Instead of going to the landfill, they're put into a, I'm drawing away on the terminology, but it's a facility that basically, it's burning and it's creating electricity, it's capturing that electricity and it's selling power back to the grid. So it's similar to the biomass facility at the Johnson landfill where they're extracting the methane gas and producing electricity. Anaerobic digestion type of projects that we're seeing proposed potentially are that 500 kW to 1 megawatt. So they're much smaller than the type of project that you see like the Johnson landfill. Net metered systems are pretty straightforward in terms of you install the solar cell on your rooftop, the power goes back to the grid, it tracks the solar generation. So if your system is producing more than you're using, your meter goes backwards instead of the current way it goes. Net metered is a pretty straightforward process. It's generally roof mounted, residential or commercial or school type projects. Really no controversies that we've encountered at the local level across the state. It's a pretty straightforward process. Again, the net metering program is available to a wide variety of customers. I would say a majority of our net metered projects, it's actually overwhelmingly, most are residential-based projects where they're just sizing the system to meet the needs of their property. Homeowners generally have 2 options. One is they can directly own it, or they enter into a third-party arrangement where you enter into a PPA at a price per kilowatt that's lower than what you're paying National Grid. That's sometimes attractive for homeowners that want to do that, but they don't have the $10,000, $15,000 out of pocket to throw down for a down payment. So this is pretty common. There's 27 states that allow third-party financing. We allowed it starting in 2016. So Tesla, Solar City, those type of companies will come in, install the system, enter into an arrangement. They'll monetize the federal tax credit because they have the tax appetite to monetize that. And then generally they'll give you an agreement, and then you have an option of purchasing the system 5 years from now at a depreciated value. So it's an attractive option for those that don't have that money sitting in their accounts. And again, this is just an example of a net metered system in Wakefield. Generally, a solar developer will look at the entire roof space to figure out where's the appropriate southwest facing orientation. This is Rocky Hill School in Warwick, again, a small solar installation. So this is the program that you're likely to see quite a few projects if you haven't already. So I believe one example is the, I think it's Southern Sky Renewables is proposing to do a project on undeveloped residential lots of land, which is consistent with state law. It's likely a virtual net meter project where you'll build that system at that location, and the power produced or the credits produced from that solar system will be linked with an energy off-taker, whether it's in Hopkinton or any other part of the state, where you basically enter into a net meter arrangement. This is becoming more and more common. An example of this is in Cranston on privately owned land. They're going to build a solar project, and the off-taker is the city of Providence. So they'll direct the energy credits produced from that system and match it up with the city of Providence's electricity billing accounts. Another example of this is the 3 or 4 wind turbines built on privately owned land in Coventry, and the energy off-taker was the town of West Warwick. So the town of West Warwick gets the energy credits from that solar system. This is likely to be the predominant program because there's no programmatic megawatt cap associated with it, whereas there is either fiscal or cap restraints with other programs. And generally these projects are the 3, 5, up to 10 megawatt scale projects. So I know you have one if you start seeing other project proposals. And this is obviously if the town of Hopkinton had any parcels of land that you couldn't do any type of economic development for, if you have like a closed landfill, the town of Hopkinton could do this, where they could enter into an arrangement with a solar developer, enter into a lower price per kilowatt than they would the way they currently play National Grid through standard offer. We are actually assisting the town of Barrington and Bristol. They put out an RFP in the fall of 2016 and mapped out certain parcels, either rooftop town-owned buildings, or they have a closed landfill in Bristol. They put out the RFP, they got, I think, 15 to 18 really solid proposals from the renewable market. They're reviewing the proposals right now and whittling down to the top 3 or 4, but the towns are going to enter into a good arrangement, and they're going to be getting a revenue source off of land that they, or roof space that they wouldn't otherwise use. So if the towns have interest, we're always happy to help with that process. This is another component of the virtual net metering program. So sometimes you have a residential community that is just surrounded by trees, or is just non-southwest facing roof spaces. So the state developed a program to allow homeowners that want to pursue solar installations but can't do it on their respective properties, but also affordable housing complexes. So say you have 30 homes in a part of Hopkinton, and you have another parcel at the other part where it's undeveloped residential lot. Instead of doing 15 homes on that property, you could do one solar system and then identify the residential off-takers within the town of Hopkinton that can enter into an agreement with that solar arrangement. So that's this component of the virtual net metering program. So virtual net metering is the key program that you guys will probably see on the projects over the next couple of years.
I guess I was thinking of the virtual net metering being solar, more commercial in nature, but it sounds like it could be also residential.
It can be residential, so the eligible customers that, or what we say is the energy off-takers for the systems are state agencies, quasi-state agencies, municipalities, public schools, private schools, hospitals, nonprofits, and the federal government. So they're allowed to virtual net meter, i.e. they can't do a system at their property because they don't have enough geographical space. An example of this is Brown University. They don't have geographic, so they're looking to do a virtual net meter arrangement with another portion of the state. So virtual net metering is limited to a customer pool, so if you're just a Dunkin' Donuts business owner or a homeowner, you may not be able to participate. So there's key provisions in the state law that dictate who can virtual net meter. The final program that I'll mention at the state level is, again, this is the program, I think, what the planning director mentioned. You have a couple 250 kW ground mount solar arrays on a couple farmland type properties within Hopkinton. This is the program they're likely participating in. It's the Renewable Energy Growth Tariff Program, and this is where you install the solar system and then sell that revenue stream back for a 20-year duration. This is also the program applicable to the tangible tax formula that you guys adopted last week.
And the one we approved on Route 91, I think it's virtual, because I think there's a state division of the state that's going to be.
So that's
going to be the
60-acre.
Yeah.
That's a virtual net metered project.
Well, yeah, there's going to be revenue, obviously, for us and the
Yeah.
developer, but I think there's a division within the state of Rhode Island that's going to be benefiting. I forget the term that you called it when they're.
The off-taker.
The off-taker.
Gotcha.
They're going to be the off-taker.
Okay. Gotcha.
Among, I guess, whoever else.
Yeah, the opportunity is the developer can build out the project, identify an off-taker. There's nothing preventing him from adding new off-takers to the system.
Right.
We're seeing that up in Johnston, some industrial zoned area. They're going to put a couple turbines up. Some of those projects are selling power back to the grid, and the town is receiving a revenue stream from them. I think 2 of them will be virtual net metered, where they'll identify who the possible off-takers could be from across the state. And this is just an example. So this is a closed landfill up in East Providence. This is a 3.5+ megawatt scale solar system. It was installed in 2012, early parts of 2013. It's been in operation for just under 4 years. And this is a project that is the city of East Providence put on RFP. They had a parcel of land that they were never going to use for any type of economic development. They entered into an arrangement with a renewable developer. That developer is now paying them a revenue stream for the next 20 years at that location. And the city is actually expanding that system out by additional 4 megawatts capacity. So that will increase the city's revenue stream from that closed landfill for the next 20 years. And again, this is just a couple examples I think I gave to you guys of just some of the installations and just a little bit more general background. The only other thing I'll highlight is the federal tax credit. It's a 30% federal tax credit. It's available to a homeowner or a business. And generally what you do is you'll get your total project cost, and then depending on the state program that you leverage when you pull the trigger. So if you pull the trigger this year, when you do your tax returns for 2018 in February of next year, this is when you get the tax return check for this 30% investment that you made. Federal tax credits in place for the next couple of years. It will start to decrease in value, I believe, starting in 2019 or 2020. But pretty much all of the projects that you see across the state are the projects that are proposed within the town. They're leveraging the state program with the federal tax credit.
I wonder how does that information get into like a TurboTax or whatever it is?
That's a really good question. I always
Because I
encourage.
do my own taxes, and you wonder if it's. I guess it might connect when I obviously choose where I live and all that stuff.
It's in one of those weird brackets.
Yeah.
That's why I go to H&R Block or something, because I can't figure it out. So.
I'll have to cross that bridge if I.
Well, we always do tell homeowners and others, just make sure you know exactly what that step is before you proceed with a project, because we've gotten calls from homeowners, and shame on certain developers, but they don't explain that process at the beginning, and then come March, April following year, they're calling us, asking us how to do it.
It's
And
too
we're just
late.
like, it's not our expertise, I don't really know what to do with that process, so I think that's it. Yeah, and then this is actually just a good one in terms of some of these projects that are built out in the woods if they're kept away from the main road. So this is a 2 megawatt ground mount project at the Layden Christmas Tree Farm in West Greenwich, on Lake 6. So as you can see, the photo to the right is when you pull up to the property off the road and come into the parking lot. And what they did was they built a solar system in the back part of the property so it couldn't be visually seen, which is always an opportunity when these projects are pitched, depending on the geographical location that they're being desired in.
I was just curious, have you seen some of these Senator House bills? We had in our packet some of the, this one particular House Senate bill that has to deal with farm, forest, and open space.
Okay, so I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's a little little confusing, and, you know, I kind of thought we were going to.
We're going to get into it now.
Sure, no, happy to.
Yeah.
So,
You know, it's just-
and I'm glad that you mentioned this, I totally forgot to put this in the slide.
Okay.
So, the dynamic that we were facing with so there's farmlands across the state that are being pitched solar projects that are within the DEM Farm Forest Open Space Program. Those farms entered into the DEM program several years ago, if not decades ago, where they are assessed at a different land value than what they could otherwise be assessed. So what we did was OER, DEM, several environmental/conservation groups, the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns, and I know when the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns looks at legislation, they generally reach out to different groups representing municipal, so they reached out to the Rhode Island Tax Assessors Organization. So we reached a compromise basically saying that if a farmer wants to pursue a solar system or a renewable system on their farmland property, they could do so and not be impacted by the land value taxation process if they restrict it to no more than 20% of the total acreage at the site. So that legislation became law in July. So that went into effect immediately. There's no rule or regulation process. So if a tax assessor receives a solar project on a farmland and it's listed as being within the DEM program, we'll have to identify the total acreage, what's the geographic footprint that the project is being proposed. That 20% could be redesignated as a commercial land value taxation because it's no longer farmland to a certain extent because it's producing an energy source of revenue. The rest of the property would stay within the land value taxation at the farmland assessed value, but it would bring clarity basically statewide because the dynamic that we faced was if a farmer wants to do a project and they go through the hoops of the interconnection study and all this type of stuff, and then they bring it to the town and the town agrees, but then they reassess the tax value of the entire whole farm, it throws off the economics of the solar project. So this was just, again, similar to the building permit process and the statewide formula, is just have some level of consistency so all parties know what they're getting into. So again, if a farmer converts that portion of land, then the tax assessor can reassess that land value outside of a farmland designation, but picks the rest of that farmland that's undisturbed within that farmland taxation value. DEM is working on a rule and regulation because as part of this conversation, we want to try to maximize the property so there's a dual purpose. So depending on the solar array that's proposed and the height variance from the ground up in terms of these solar ground mount, you could still cultivate and utilize the property around the solar panels and stuff like that, depending on how high up those solar systems are. Some are 5 to 10 feet off the ground, some are 15 to 20 feet off the ground. So if you do a solar system properly, it could still allow that farmer to cultivate and maximize that land surrounding the solar system. So we wanted to have renewable developers and farmlands think about that option within this DEM program. So the DEM has to develop a guideline as to what they would deem a dual purpose.
It's a little confusing in there.
Yeah, well, other states have done it. Massachusetts has a designation in terms of a dual purpose.
I don't know how you can have a dual purpose when you have, X amount of space.
Well, again, it just depends on how high the turbines are built, because some of these projects are, solar systems, I'm mixing up. So solar systems that are produced, but again, it does apply to all renewable technologies. So when DEM is looking at this dual purpose designation, they're also going to look at wind turbines because they have a smaller geographical footprint that takes up an area compared to a solar system.
So if I have a 100-acre farm,
Yep.
use round numbers, and I'm in farm forest open space,
Yep.
and I want to turn 20 acres of that, that's my 20%.
Okay.
That will be reassessed at a different rate at 20%, but there's no penalty for taking that 20 acres out of the farm forest open space.
So there would be no penalty for the 80% of the remaining acreage. You wouldn't be having to reassess that entire land value. So it would just reassess that 20 acres.
Just the 20
Yeah,
that's
just the 20 acres.
Now, if they do, as you say, dual purpose, say they're planting pumpkins underneath of it or something like that, how would that be reassessed?
So these,
valuation because, I mean, you're still using it as agriculture. I understand it with the wind turbine because that only takes a small footprint and you're gaining that. Has that been determined yet?
so we are in the
Assess that?
beginning stages. So one other thing I'll talk about tonight is just we're talking about renewable energy siting. So Ken Ayers, the chief of the DEM Agriculture Division, he's in charge of working on this. Basically, it's an update to the farm forest open-space rules and regulations. So he has to start developing that, and what we've been doing is similar to what we're doing with a statewide solar building permit, is he'll draft the language and then he'll put it out to municipalities, to the Farm Bureau Association, others to comment on, but also looking at what other states have done in terms of trying to maximize that land for multiple purposes. So again, the law passed in July. It doesn't go into effect, I think, until January of next year. But I think Ken Ayers and the DEM Agricultural Division are kind of at the beginning stage of the process. But similar to other things, we're going to be reaching out to all municipalities to get their feedback. So when this thing is formally adopted, everybody's had a chance to weigh in and give their input.
You all set?
But you have some good questions. I just don't have the answers tonight, just because we're at the beginning stage of the process.
I wanted to find out, or we need to identify whether or not a community can determine its own farm forest and open space. Where I'm going is, we passed a couple of ordinances, and one of them was, we amended the farm viability ordinance.
Okay.
And so we only allow farms based upon their size to anywhere from 1 to 3 acres of their land. What we want to know and what they want to know or need to know is, can the town of Hopkinton decide that the land, let's say they just do 1 acre, that the land, and they need that 1 acre. Let's suppose, what is it, 15 acres for, okay, 15 acres they got to have. But what if they take one of them? They take one of them out of the farm forest and open space. Do they now, because now they only have 14. So my concern is anybody who does that then gets kicked out of the program because they really needed that 1 acre. That's a concern. Our thrust was to help the farmers to find a way where they could come up with a little more revenue so that they could sustain the farm and perhaps grow it. What we were hoping for is that the farmers wouldn't have to pay more, that the land under the, if they took that 1 acre, that land still be assessed that lower amount because it's part of farm forest and open space.
Yep.
Is solar, can we see solar as an agriculture, as part of the farm aspect? So we'd like to do that. Can we do that? Do we have authority to do
So to
that?
expand on, so Chris may not know that we have a farm viability ordinance, which you probably have not read or seen. So that's what kind of muddies the water on that particular part of it.
Okay.
You know, I think it's our intent as a council to perhaps not reassess that part of solar on the farmer's land, keep it as is, and maybe tax on the tangibles.
So what your other question is, so you have the state law, if the town wanted to waive that requirement, they don't want to collect an additional tax revenue off that 1 acre, would that be allowed? That's a legal question. I certainly would be happy if I get your guys' contact information. I'd be more than happy to pose that question to the DEM team and circle back with you on that. I know, for example, there's a state law that allows municipalities to waive tangible property taxes on renewable systems. So most are waiving them for net metered systems that are just.
We do that too.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some lax if the town doesn't want to collect tangible taxes on a system selling power to the grid. Say it's a school within the district. They want to see that all that revenue go back into the school. They don't want to collect taxes, so there's some flexibility. I just don't have the answer to that question, but I'd be more than happy to circle back with you on it.
Is it, Sylvia, is it 15 acres that keeps you in it?
Yeah. So we wouldn't want to lose that. We would, and we want to tax them at what they're being taxed now.
Let me chat with Ken Ayers. I know he's at a conference remainder of this week. One other thing related to this topic is the renewable energy siting topic has been a very hot button issue all over the state over the last several years. There were various bills filed this past legislative session by various stakeholders in terms of wanting to have some level of consistency in terms of siting of renewable projects. So there was one bill focused on agricultural land type properties. There was a second one focused just on solar siting in general. We recognize that these bills are going to, in some fashion, get reintroduced, similar to there was the farmland bill as it relates to like weddings and concerts, and generally what we like to do, as we've done with other things, we like with the League of Cities and Towns input representing municipalities, is if we know something's going to come in January, well, let's not waste the next 5+ months, give or take, by ignoring it, and then everybody get into their defense silo positions at the State House come January, February. So we've actually scheduled stakeholder meetings to discuss renewable energy siting issues, recognizing that there's going to be bills filed by stakeholders come February. So I believe we have put out a broad net. I believe somebody from the town of Hopkinton has been participating in those stakeholder meetings. I'm pretty sure I have
Planner
some.
maybe?
I'm spacing out on who I have from the town.
Harvey.
Maybe, yeah. But the League, Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns, the Rhode Island Tax Assessors, the Farm Bureau, conservation groups, the developers are all at the table. So we have all these meetings pre-booked. But a part of those meetings, we're discussing the dual purpose designation criteria, because while we have everybody in the room, let's have that conversation as well. So I know DEM has to go through their formal rule and regulation process outside of the stakeholder meeting. So I just wanted to highlight that there'll be ample opportunity for the town of Hopkinton to weigh in on that regulation that's developed by DEM.
Is there going to be a limit on the number of megawatts, for instance, that the whole state can have? And what I would say is we have a landfill that and the site, I think it's a total of 60 acres. I'm not sure how much is landfill, but it's been capped already. So my question would be, when I asked about any limits that we're going to have on the state, when does it come to a point where like, oh, that's enough? Are we going to miss any boats, any deadlines? Because we haven't done a thing about the landfill yet.
So as it relates to the renewable energy programs at the state level, most of them are already in place for either indefinitely. So the virtual net metering program, there is no statutory end date with that program. With the renewable energy growth tariff program, the 250 kW solar projects that you guys have approved for some of the farmlands within the town, that program was just extended out to 2029. So the state programs are in place for the next several plus years. The federal level is just an unknown right now on a lot of things. The federal tax credit is in place for the next couple of years. There's always ways around that to figure out you can convert you can create properties that are LLC, therefore that are taxable. So I know that's been the case with some towns across the country where they don't pay federal taxes, so they can't monetize the federal ITC, but you can enter into tax arrangements, LLCs with a developer where that land is redesignated, so it's paying federal taxes, therefore it can sell. There's ways you can do it. As it relates to the town of Hopkinton property, I would certainly love to know more about that location, because we're encouraging municipalities, if they have closed landfills that they'll never do anything else with, to at least put out an RFP to see what you get. Again, we worked with the town of Barrington and Bristol on their RFP. We helped draft it. Once the town was comfortable with it, we released it to 400+ solar stakeholders in the market, and then we assisted the town in terms of reviewing the proposals, giving them feedback. So if the town ever wants us, we don't charge. We're happy to help you through that process.
We were told from one of the solar companies that looked at the landfill, they looked at the town land, and the landfill, for instance, is at a distance out, so the revenue would be less, that's all. But it is doable.
And the phase 3 line is too far to connect. Cost per header almost.
But before we could do an RFP, we were told that before you can even do that, you need to know what's the cost going to be at National Grid. So they said we needed to do an audit, and then when you go out to bid and you select somebody, you require as part of the bid documents that we recoup the cost.
So generally what happens with it, as it relates to National Grid, any renewable project has to do a interconnection impact study to assess the distribution system and where it's being tapped into. What I would say is that development that you spoke with may have had some valid points, but I would always err on the side of caution about putting out an RFP, because while one developer says it's not possible, there's more than likely 5 or 6 developers that says you can do it. And as it relates to the National Grid component, we work with National Grid in terms of trying to get preliminary information regarding a location, so they can give a high level. So, for example, we're going to be putting out an RFP over the next few months for some undeveloped land at the Lad Center in Exeter. We're looking to do a 5-megawatt ground mount project. So we just reach out to National Grid and they'll give us a preliminary assessment of the location, of what the interconnection points are, where are the certain hot points you got to be mindful of when you propose a project. And we just attach that as an addendum to our RFP. So when the developers look at the site, they've got a reference point of what National Grid's high-level assessment will be. Ultimately, any developer that gives you a proposal is going to be with contingencies when they submit to an RFP, because the nuts and bolts about what that specific interconnection cost will be, you won't know that until that developer formally files an interconnection study and National Grid's civil engineer team does a full dive through. And that review process generally takes anywhere from 2 to 4 months to complete. So they'll give a high-level assessment to the state, and which we would be happy to help the town of Hopkinton with. But the nitty-gritty as to what is truly feasible won't be known for a couple of months after a town selected a developer. So that's what we're doing with the town of Barrington, Bristol. They're giving, the developers are giving, here are the economics, here's what we are offering you for incentives or either lower electricity bills, or we're going to lease the land from you and we're going to give you a portion of the revenue generated off the power sold. Town's probably going to select that developer probably within the next 2 or 3 months, and then the next step will be that developer formally files the interconnection studies for some of the town roof spaces for the Bristol closed landfill, and then we'll recircle back. The reality of what I tell towns is, if towns are looking to do a project, you have to have a realistic of probably 2 to 4 years from the start of the process to the system being installed and operational. That is usually the time horizon that it takes for these projects to get up and running. But again, we can get the information. If you guys give us the street address and all that, we can reach out to National Grid, get a high-level interconnection assessment. We can give you a drafted RFP for the property. Again, we don't charge for that, so it's just a request the town makes, and we can get it done. I can give you the contacts. I can give you the contacts in Bristol that are very happy.
Okay.
Be good to see that.
Can benefit from it, actually.
This was easy. I'm happy to take any questions.
Quite frankly, from my point of view, my biggest concern is the farm force and open space aspect. Because now the farm, I know one farmer, for instance, has already ended into a contract with somebody, and they don't know those answers. So I worry about people signing up and then you find out something later.
Profit's not
It's
going
gonna
to
cost
If you happen to get any farmers that are approached by solar developers, feel free to pass along our contact information. We'll put them in touch with our office, with DEM, make sure everything is, because I know we've also come to grasp with some farmers in other parts of the state have entered into solar projects, not being aware of some of the agreements that they execute with DEM in terms of conservation and others from the 1990s or early 2000s, and then are told after the fact that you should have done this because you're in violation of your deed restriction or something along that. So if you get any questions from farmers, we're happy to answer or just put them in touch with the appropriate people in the state before they execute an agreement with a solar developer.
how do you want to be reached? By email?
Email is the best way to reach me. I'm pretty responsive, usually less than 24 hours. So again, if the town, what we would be happy to do is meet with the appropriate people within the town. Myself and Shauna from our office would come down, sit down with you guys, scope out the RFP, go out to the site. We'd also reach out to the director of National Grid Interconnection team to inform him of this location, get his feedback. I suspect we can get feedback from National Grid high level about that location. But also, again, what we told the town of Barrington, Bristol is put everything in the RFP. You don't have to choose anything, but at least put all the parcels or properties that may be viable for solar, and let the market tell you what's feasible, because the market's gonna do the three-dimensional drawings, the shade analysis, and all those type of things. They're not gonna charge you, they're gonna be thrilled. I suspect because of the situation that we saw with Barrington, Bristol, if we put out an RFP, or the town put out an RFP and we advertise it, at minimum, you probably get 16 proposals. And that's a good situation to have, because a lot of the proposals that we looked at were very financially attractive for the town. And it's all free.
Would you want to have a copy of our farm viability ordinance? I guess would that be?
Yeah, feel free to send it to me, because I can pass that along to the team
Yeah,
at
just
DEM
so
and
you
get
have
their
a
feedback.
sense of what we're talking
Sure,
about, I guess.
I'd be more than happy to do that.
Yeah.
So Lisa, you send that out?
The Cat landfill, which one was that? That was,
That is,
Well, Warwick also was done.
East, is that the East Providence?
That's East Providence.
How many acres is that?
So,
Do you know?
so that project there, oh God. I'm gonna overestimate on this one probably, but I would say it's probably somewhere between 10 to 20 acres of land. It's located near I-95. Again, they did this, they started this project in 2010, 2011. So they put out an RFP. Now bear in mind, when they put out this RFP, there was a minimal solar market in Rhode Island. There was not the level of competition and the proposals that we're receiving now. So this was an unclosed landfill too. So they had to get crushed stone and debris. So they lucked out that I believe they were able to secure like crushed stone material from the I-195 undeveloped lot. So they were able to redirect that. With you guys, if you have a closed landfill and it's relatively in good shape, we would also probably want to check in with DEM with you guys just in terms of, is there anything we should be aware from the environmental permit process that you would want to reference within an RFP?
60. I don't know the landfill, but the size of that parcel is 60
Yeah.
acres.
So that's,
And we were considering, and the two parcels that seemed to be viable for the town was that one and land behind us here. It was 19 acres.
okay. And that's the other thing is, and this is what we're telling the towns, is if you've got property that you can't do anything else, you can do it in a responsible manner. I mean, there's nothing preventing you from doing a virtual net meter project and entering into a price for your electricity at a lower rate long-term, so you know what exactly your price per kilowatt will be for all your town accounts. And then a separate parcel of land, you just install a solar system and sell the revenue. And you guys get a revenue stream, and you can use that revenue for other purposes within the town with that developer. So there's different ways we can go about this RFP, which is why it's critical just to put all the potential properties out there for the market to give you a reaction to, and then you can evaluate and see what's within your comfort level and what makes economic sense.
Sounds good. Identify the properties and then get them to you, I guess? Or-
Yeah, so just shoot us an email with the street address, all the properties that may be feasible.
What would be the minimum size property to be feasible? 5 acres, 10 acres?
5 acres.
So 5 acres enough.
Usually a 1 megawatt ground mount system requires about 4 to 5 acres of property.
Yes, Jim?
Yeah, Chris, when these projects generally come to the town, they come to the town presented as DC projects,
Yeah.
5 megawatts DC. Now, when it comes time to tax them, the developers like to talk in terms of AC.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, why was the legislation written? I mean, that can lead to a lot of confusion,
Yeah.
okay, among people. When they're presented with a 5 megawatt and then they do the mathematics, they find out, oh, I'm not getting that. So I was wondering, what's the rationale? Why did we switch from DC to AC for the purposes of that $5 taxation?
So the DC to AC, I am not an electrical engineer, so I don't even go there in terms of my understanding of that process, in terms of how the electrons flow. My understanding was AC was what the formula was for the tax treaty type agreements that were executed between developers and municipalities from 2010 through the end of 2015. So when we were negotiating, discussing legislation between the renewable energy market, the league of cities and towns, they were all, we'll make sure it's in an AC formula. So that was really me just being a part of the negotiation. So I don't have a specific answer as to why it was done, but my understanding was all the prior tax treaty agreements were executed through an AC value. I believe all for solar. I know there was a discrepancy between some of the solar projects and wind projects, some being in a DC value and solar being in an AC value, but ultimately through the legislative negotiations, they settled on the AC value as the principle that applies to the formula.
Well, it refers to a nameplate value.
Yep.
And I can see where a nameplate on a DC, system is all set up. That's the boilerplate on the system.
Yeah.
But when you convert from DC to AC, there's various percentages that you get. I've seen everything from like 70 to it all depends on the type of inverter you use.
So
what nameplate are they going to be looking at to determine the amount of AC that's produced?
So I think, as you mentioned, the DC, I believe, is the nameplate capacity, rated output of that solar system.
Well, it also says in the tax legislation, it mentions nameplate. So is there an AC nameplate as well as a DC nameplate?
So it's a really good question. I just don't have the legislative law in front of me. Again, I'm going based upon the negotiations in terms of, my understanding is the AC was the reference point because that's the actual, what is produced at the respective site. Because again, you can install a 1 megawatt ground mount solar system and it's rated for a 1 megawatt ground mount output. If it's in optimal conditions, it's not snowing out, it's not raining out, So I think they adjusted the AC to reflect the actual output of the solar system. Because again, National Grid tracks the solar system, all the electrons that are produced, they track every single credit of that because Grid is required to compensate for the actual generation of the solar system, I think through an AC value. So that may have also been another reason why it was done in the AC formula, was because they don't want to overcompensate a solar system that actually is producing, it's rated as a 1 megawatt ground mount at the landfill, but the reality is if it's rating out 3 weeks total out of the 52 weeks of the year, it's not actually producing 1 megawatt. So you don't want to compensate and have ratepayers paying for something that's not actually generating what it's saying it's going to do. Rather, as I believe AC is what is actually transmitted back to the grid as credits, and that tracks from National Grid in terms of what they need to cut a check for that developer and ultimately that property owner as well. So that's my best understanding.
Well, I think that's a good reason for doing that way.
It's my
But now, would a town would have to get the electric bill? I mean, how would the town know how much AC it is?
So this is the one thing that we tell towns not to get involved in any capacity is in terms of what is the solar system producing. I've had some municipalities want to craft net metering ordinances at the local level in terms of they want to get into what the solar system is producing on that building or that roof space. We have state laws that are very strict in terms of the generation of these systems. National Grid is the entity that tracks all the electrical generation of the output. They have to still go at the local level to pull the building electric permits, but in terms of electron flowing and how much credit's being produced and all those things, that's all oversight by National Grid.
Right, but won't the tax assessor have to know how much AC that's actually producing to levy that tax?
So ultimately, what we require as part of the issuing of the tangible tax revenue, I think we put it in the model warrants that you guys adopted, is that developer has to provide a copy of their interconnection service agreement with National Grid. That will tell you exactly what the output of the solar system is, and that way your local tax assessor has that specific line item within the interconnection service agreement to say, okay, GEP Renewables, your interconnection agreement is for a 2.72 ground mount megawatt rated solar system. It's going to produce XY kilowatts. It's that kilowatts times the $5. That's what you're required to pay the municipality when it goes online. But it's a good question, very good question.
Yeah, when I read this proposed Senate bill on farm force and open where is the number? S0570. And it is confusing. But it does in the end seem to imply that the Farm Forest and Open Space, if they take a section of their land off and to reuse it for renewable energy, it's going to be taken off of the Farm Forest and Open Space, according to this Senate bill that's being proposed. So I guess that's a DEM question.
Yeah,
The
I don't
town
have the
doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, I don't have the specific answer, I don't want to give you the wrong
Right.
information, so I want
Yeah,
to
you're going to look it
I'm
up.
going to circle back with Ken Ayers and the guys over there about that question. If somebody could just shoot me the question, the scenario type question, that would just help me get it to Ken, and I can probably circle back with you within the next week or two on that matter.
So do you want to email?
Yeah, I'll do it with Lisa, and hopefully even if it does mean that, is there a way that any community can,
We can forego it.
yeah, or
And
there's maybe
like I said,
legislation that,
This legislation is not set in stone.
Right.
So again, it was something that we were pressed to try to to address the situation. I've never worked on a bill that's 100% not flawed. So
yeah,
if there's a flaw, there's something that we didn't think about last session, that we could easily add a line item to give the towns the ability to not enforce that provision. I think myself, from OER, DEM,
I would think
would be all
DEM would say,
ears.
hey, Hopkinton wants to keep it
Yeah.
that way, why
and it
not?
may have just simply been something we didn't think about last session, but I can't think of, if we don't have the legal ability to waive it, that it requires something that we bring across the legislature this upcoming session by, again, your representative, Senator, can introduce the bill. So let's just circle back, first get the answer to the basic question. If there's an issue, I'm always happy to have a dialogue about that topic.
Yeah, anybody else out in the public that have any questions for Chris? Okay, I guess that concludes our workshop. Thank you.